So welcome to week 3 of a series we're doing called See for Yourself. There are several places in the Bible where it tells us to do something and see. See for yourself. There are things that God doesn't just want us to hear about. He wants us to experience those things. So 2 weeks ago we introduced a series and talked about come and see. Come and see. And then last week, Heather did an amazing job with taste and see. So thank you, Heather, for that. And if you missed either of those, you can watch those on our YouTube channel. But tonight we're going to look at a story from the Old Testament that covers the phrase, go and see. Go and see. So I use the word story to talk about this simply because it's in narrative form. This is a story of history. This is real people's lives. It's their story. And God included it in the Bible so that we could learn from that and that could influence our stories as well. But the story we're going to look at tonight is not a famous Bible story that you may have heard in Sunday school. It's kind of an obscure story, but it illustrates this idea of go and see so well. We're going to jump right into the text tonight because I love the way that the relevance just kind of jumps out at us at the end of the story. So our main passage is in 2 Kings chapter 7. I encourage you to open up a Bible app to follow along so you can see for yourself what God's Word is saying. We're going to set the context by looking at a couple verses from the previous chapter. So 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 24 and 25. It says, afterward Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, mustered his entire army and went up and besieged Samaria. There was a great famine in Samaria, and as they besieged it, until a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver, and the fourth part of a cab of dove's dung for 5 shekels of silver. Now, let me point out a couple footnotes. Depending on the translation that you read that in, you might have seen the word Aram instead of Syria. Don't worry, it's talking about the same place. You may have also seen the words seed pods instead of dove dung. If you've got a little footnote there, it will say also it refers to dove dung. I don't know if we had been out in the amphitheater, you may have seen a little bird poop somewhere that had some raspberry seeds or something in it. There you go, there's some seed pods. So, at this point in history, Israel had gone through civil war, and it was now 2 kingdoms. The southern kingdom of Judah continued to follow the line of King David as their king and as their ruler, and Jesus came through that lineage. And they had a mix of good kings and evil kings over the centuries. But Samaria, that's the place we're talking about in this passage, was the capital city of the northern kingdom. And sometimes the kingdom was still called Israel. Sometimes they referred to it by its capital city of Samaria. But after that civil war, Samaria went from one evil king to another. They never had another good, godly king since that civil war. The kings just followed idols and pulled the people away from God. Nevertheless, God continued to send prophets to his people to try to get their attention, try to turn them back to him, and there were little glimpses of that here and there. So that's where we're at in this passage. And the Syrian or Aramean army had surrounded the capital city of Samaria. And Samaria had a pretty good fortified wall. And so the Syrians are like, hey, instead of just getting picked off by the archers on the wall, let's just camp around the city and starve them out. And so that's what they did. They cut off their trade routes. They cut off the farmlands that were outside the city walls and just waited. And the Bible, this passage doesn't give us the time frame, but it was at least months, maybe several years that this happened. So the famine in Samaria was so bad that people paid a high price, 80 shekels for a donkey's head. Now, Jews weren't supposed to eat donkey meat anyways, and the head of an animal is pretty much like the least useful part of it as far as food goes, but they were that desperate. They were even paying 5 shekels for a container of dove dung because they were so hungry. They just wanted to put something in them. I can't imagine being that hungry. But that's where they were at. Chapter 6 even goes on to say that a couple people had even resorted to cannibalism. It was a horrible situation. Chapter 6 ends with the king of Samaria coming to the prophet Elisha and saying, blaming God for everything bad that was happening to them. So this is the context leading into chapter 7. That's where we're going to look at. So 2 Kings 7, we're going to read 1 through 17. We're going to work our way through that. So 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 1. But Elisha said, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, tomorrow at this time, a seah of fine flour shall be sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria. And the captain on whose hand the king leaned said to the man of God, if the Lord himself should make windows in heaven, could this thing be? But he, Elijah, said, you shall see it with your own eyes, but you shall not eat of it. So their units of measure don't really mean much to us, but a quarter cab was roughly a pint. This much, 16 ounces, roughly, was this quarter cab. And a seah was 24 times that amount. So Elisha was saying, you blame God for this? Here's God's promise. He says, today, because of the famine, a pint of pigeon poop was selling for 5 shekels. But tomorrow by this time, 3 gallons of fine flour will sell for only 1 shekel because the famine will be completely over. And the captain was like, you're crazy, Elijah. There's no way God could keep that promise. Ain't no way he could deliver on that. So Elijah replies, okay then, well, you're going to see it happen, but you're not going to experience it. So, verse 3. Now there were 4 men who were lepers at the entrance to the gate. I'll pause again there. Leprosy was a disease where people's skin and eventually other parts of their body just kind of rotted, and eventually they'd fall off. And they'd experience a lot of suffering over time and eventually die. But their suffering wasn't just physical. Jews who had leprosy weren't allowed to interact with anyone else. If they entered a public space like this, they'd have to cover themselves and yell out, unclean, so that everyone would give them space. So could you imagine for the rest of your life having to announce your flaws everywhere you went? Could you imagine never receiving a hug or a handshake or a fist bump or having someone step within touching distance of you for the rest of your life? They were completely rejected by society. So, these 4 guys were sitting outside of the city gates of Samaria. Continuing in verse 3. They said to one another, why are we sitting here until we die? If we say, let us enter the city, the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. If we sit here, we shall die also. So now come, let us go over to the camp of the Syrians. If they spare our lives, we shall live. And if they kill us, we shall but die. So they arose at twilight to go to the camp of the Syrians. It was getting dark, so they probably intended to sneak in. But when they got to the edge of the camp of the Syrians, behold, there was no one there. For the Lord had made the army of the Syrians hear the sound of chariots and horses, the sound of a great army, so that they said to one another, behold, the king of Israel has hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Egypt to come against us. So they fled away in the twilight and abandoned their tents, their horses, their donkeys, leaving the camp as it was, and fled for their lives. And when these lepers came to the edge of the camp, they went into a tent and ate and drank. They carried off silver and gold and clothing and went and hid them. They came back and entered another tent and carried off things from it and went and hid them. So these 4 guys say, if we go into the city, we're going to die. If we stay here, we're going to die. Let's see if we can find food at the enemy camp. And if they kill us, we're going to die anyways. So they go into the camp and they hit the jackpot. Nobody was there. It was deserted. They eat their fill. They find steak and fine wine, and Doritos, Mountain Dews, whatever you get your fill of. And they find treasure and they go and bury the treasure. And all of that was in the first tent. And so they go into another tent. They go bury some treasure from that tent. It would have been so easy for them to ignore the society that had rejected them. But that's not what happened. Verse 9. Then they said to one another, "We are not doing right. This day is a day of good news. If we are silent and wait till the morning light, punishment will overtake us. Now therefore come, let us go and tell the king's household." So they felt convicted. Guys, this is wrong. And if we get caught trying to hoard all this for ourselves, it's going to end bad. So let's go tell the king. Verse 10. So they came and called to the gatekeepers of the city and told them, "We came to the camp of the Syrians, and behold, there was no one to be seen or heard there. Nothing but the horses tied, the donkeys tied, and the tents as they were." Then the gatekeepers called out, and it was told within the king's household. And the king rose in the night and said to his servants, "I will tell you what the Syrians have done to us. They know that we are hungry, therefore they have gone out of the camp to hide themselves in the open country, thinking when they come out of the city we shall take them alive and get into their city." So the people of Samaria have been suffering really bad. The king hears, hey, there's good news. The enemy is gone. The famine is over. But the king starts to listen to some negative thoughts. It's a trap. Don't believe that good news. Just stay here where it's safe. But then one of his servants gives the king some super wise counsel. So verse 13. One of his servants said, "Let some men take 5 of the remaining horses, seeing that those who are left here will fare like the whole multitude of Israel who have already perished. Let us send and see." So they took 2 horsemen, and the king sent them after the army of the Syrians, saying, "Go and see." So they went after them as far as the Jordan, and behold, all the way was littered with garments and equipment that the Syrians had thrown away in their haste. And the messengers returned and told the king. Then the people went out and plundered the camp of the Syrians. So a seah of fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel, according to the word of the Lord. Now the king had appointed the captain on whose hand he had leaned to have charge of the gate, and the people trampled him in the gate, so that he died, as the man of God had said when the king came down to him. So just like Elijah prophesied, the captain who scoffed at what God could do, he saw God's promise fulfilled, but he didn't get to experience it. So I gave us some background to this story so we could understand the context and what's going on. There's a lot of cool aspects of this story that we could zero in on, we could zoom in on. We could focus on the story of the 4 lepers. We could talk about God's miraculous deliverance by scaring away the enemy army. But I want us to focus on the king of Israel in this passage. He was in a bad place. There was severe, devastating famine in the city. And he had even started to blame God for what was going on. And then he gets the report. The enemy is gone. They fled and left everything. There's tons and tons of food and treasure just waiting to be had. Just go and get it. And the king's first thought is, that's not real. That's a trap. They're just trying to ambush us while our guard is down and take the city. Negative thoughts, negative assumptions, just all that negativity. He was assuming the worst possible outcome. There's good news, but these negative feelings are standing in the way of me experiencing that good. So, raise your hand if you never wrestle with negative thoughts yourself. Oh, nobody? So I guess every one of us can relate to this story from history. But just out of curiosity, raise your hand if maybe you know this isn't true, but you feel like it is sometimes. Raise your hand if you ever wrestle with the specific negative feeling that you're the only one among your friends who wrestles with negative thoughts. Several of us. If we let it, negativity will keep us from experiencing God things. If we let it, negativity will keep us from experiencing God things. Well, what are God things? What do we mean by that? God's blessings. God's blessings on our productivity, our relationships, our witness, our creativity, our deliverance, you name it. Anything good and worthwhile, anything we could treat as a blessing from God, negativity can and will sabotage that if we let it. Let me give you an example from my life. We've been talking about life groups and discipleship groups here at His House, and those discipleship groups, those D groups that we offer, specifically go through a discipleship curriculum that we developed here. And 3 summers ago, God really convicted me that though our mission statement said we were all about discipleship, our approach to that had been extremely passive up to that point. Basically, we provided opportunities. We provided life groups. We provided ministry teams. We provided events, and then hoped that people would somehow get discipled by the system. It was very passive, very impersonal, very hit or miss. But discipling someone sounds a lot more intentional. It sounds a lot more personal. Prepare them, equip them, show them, get them ready to continue a journey of discipleship. Help them cultivate a passion for God, passion for the lost, passion to engage, passion to show the next person. So I started thinking through all the discipleship resources I'd been exposed to over the years, but I couldn't find any that did a good job of covering 3 things: the outreach part, the depth part, and the showing someone else part. There were a lot that covered one of those or 2 of those really well or were pretty good, but I couldn't find any that covered all of that. And so I felt God saying, okay, you need this in your ministry, and there's not a resource that you know of that you can just plug in and use, so develop it. So we started developing it, and I reviewed a ton of discipleship resources that had some really good pieces, did a lot of praying and fasting, narrowed in on 12 topics, and started writing. And we launched our first 2 pilot groups when it was only half written. And each semester we've added a few more groups. A few other of the His House campuses have started using it as well. It's been about a year and a half since that first draft was completed, and God's been continuing to provide ideas to refine the wording, refine the formatting, and it's this close to being ready to submit to Amazon to make it available as a professionally printed workbook that people can use. And yet last week, even all this good, I felt compelled by God, but this last week I felt very discouraged about the whole thing. I felt like, it's taking us a while to get the groups launched this semester and over the summer. The reformatting process is taking forever. I am throwing every spare moment of my time toward that. I thought the door had opened to expose our Sunday community church to this by bringing a few of their staff through a D group, and then that door closed because of schedules. And so, even though I felt inspired and compelled by God to work on this, I think it's a good thing. I think it's been effective preparing people. Last week, these negative thoughts just really got me down. And you probably know the kind of thoughts that I was dealing with. I was hearing voices like, this is a waste of your time. It's not nearly as good or helpful as you hope it is. Nobody really cares about this besides you. Stop kidding yourself. Just give up on it and let it go. Those were the negative thoughts I was feeling last week. I was tempted with those thoughts. For you, Maybe you hear laughter down the hallway, or someone walks through, and your first thought is it has something to do with you. Maybe your friend sent you a message that sounded kind of funny, and your first thought was that they meant it in the worst possible way. Maybe something your professor communicated wasn't real clear to you, but it seemed perfectly clear to everyone else. And you start to get thoughts like, I'm going to fail this. I'm stupid. Don't embarrass yourself by asking. Maybe you're experiencing some chronic pain and you fear it might be the worst, but you ignore it and don't check it out because you don't want to find out that it is the worst. Maybe you have a passion or dream, but every time you think about doing something about it, those negative thoughts come. You're not good enough for this to succeed. It won't make a difference. Move on. Maybe you long for community, but those negative thoughts keep you too suspicious to join a life group or to hang out at a guy's night or girls' night. Maybe you fear that people found out who you really were, what you've done, what was done to you, people would reject you. The famine is over, the enemy has fled, God has delivered us, but the king of Samaria had these negative thoughts in his head. It's a trap. Don't believe in this hope. And I kind of don't blame him. He was in a devastating spot. He had some extremely simple advice made the difference between him experiencing God's blessing or not. In his situation, it made the difference between the whole city of Samaria dying of starvation or not. We have a real spiritual enemy. A few churches might seem to blame demons for everything that could possibly go wrong. Other churches kind of don't even acknowledge that they exist. But demons are real, and they resent us because we have the opportunity for God's forgiveness and salvation. And the angels who sinned weren't offered that opportunity, so they've made themselves our enemies. And 1 Peter 5:8 says, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. So we do have a real enemy. They are trying to mess with things. They have supernatural power, which includes the ability to plant thoughts or suggest ideas, which is, if you've not been exposed to that before, it's kind of a scary thought that every idea that flies through your head didn't necessarily originate with you. But the Bible also says that our flesh, our own sinful tendencies, are another source of our temptation. So it's quite possible, in all honesty, a real live demon may have gotten the ball rolling, may have gotten it started by planting a negative thought. But then maybe our sinful tendencies picked up that ball and started running with it. And even though the demon was far gone by then, we just kept it into this big snowball effect and spiraling downhill. And yet, just like with the king of Israel, taking some extremely simple advice can make the difference between us experiencing God's blessing or not. That deliverance, that healing, that restoration, that community. Through Jesus, we have the ability to reject those thoughts that lead us into sin, that distract us, that paralyze us. Maybe one of the thoughts that you struggle with is that you don't have the ability to change your thoughts. But that's not true. We do have that ability through Jesus. 1 Corinthians 10:5 says, we destroy arguments, every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God. Take every thought captive to obey Christ. So we can change our thoughts. We can hold them up to what Jesus would want and then evaluate it. Is this a good thought or is this a thought I should reject? So applying this specifically to our subject of negativity, instead of letting those negative assumptions paralyze us, find out. Go and see. Instead of letting those negative assumptions paralyze us, find out. Go and see. Hey friend, you had said this, and it kind of sounded like you meant it this way. Oh, no, I didn't mean it like that at all. Sorry, I didn't communicate that well. I meant it this other way. That's a very likely situation. But here's a big hint. Always do that kind of communication in person, because it's 100 times easier to project negativity onto text than when you're in person experiencing their body language and their tone. But if we stick with those negative assumptions, instead of choosing to go and see, we can even turn it into a bad thing when it wasn't gonna be a bad thing, just because of the way we're reacting, the way we're responding to it. And I'm not saying it's always gonna be a misunderstanding. Sometimes it's gonna be a bad situation. Usually it's a misunderstanding, but not always. Bad things do happen, tragedy happens. People sometimes do betray us. But choosing to go and see frees us either way. Whether it's good or bad, it frees us. It either frees us to experience a God thing, or it frees us to properly address a bad situation. Either way, being paralyzed by that negativity only keeps us in bondage to fear. It only hurts us. So if you stick with the negative thoughts, it will hurt you. But if you go and see, it might bless you. If you stick with those negative thoughts, it will hurt you. But if you go and see, it might bless you. Again, either way, when we go and see, we're freed to address the actual situation rather than staying in fear or in doubt of what it might be. When a crowd of 5,000 was leaning in to hear Jesus teach, it was out in the countryside, it was getting late, people were starting to get angry. The disciples go to Jesus and say, send these people away. There's no way we could possibly feed these people. Just send them away. And Jesus asks them a question, gives them a little assignment. Mark 6:38, Jesus asked them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. Had they ignored his question and instruction, had they just assumed, obviously not enough to make a difference, why bother counting, they would have missed out on what Jesus could do with 5 bagels and a couple sardines. So just like the 12 disciples, just like the 4 lepers, just like the servant of the king who spoke up, when we're tempted with that spiral of negativity, if we stay there, it will do us no good. So let's go and see. See for yourself. See what it really is so we can properly address the situation. Let's pray.